how God silences fear, biblical secrets to peace, and mental freedom light up faith. Fear didn't knock the night. It almost broke him. It came like a whisper, soft, familiar, almost reasonable. And that's why he didn't fight it, that he agreed with T2:17 a.m. He was wide awake again. Not because of noise outside, but because of the storm inside. His chest felt tight. His thoughts wouldn't slow down. Every possibility twisted into the worst outcome. Every memory replayed like evidence against his future. What if this fails? What if I'm not ready? What if God never comes through? He turned to the side, staring into the darkness. And then, the most dangerous thought of all, maybe this is just reality. That's when fear wins. Not when it shouts, but when it convinces you it's telling the truth. And what he didn't realize in that moment was that he wasn't just thinking, that he was listening. Because fear has a voice, and that voice is ancient. That IT goes all the way back to a garden. Did God really say? That was the first whisper. Not loud, not aggressive, just a question. And it was enough to fracture certainty, enough to introduce doubt, enough to make Eve pause, reconsider, and slowly drift from truth. That same voice still moves today, not through serpents, but through thoughts that sound like your own. That man lying in bed that night, he wasn't weak, that he was under attack. Because fear doesn't need permission. It only needs a crack, a delay in prayer, a disappointment, a memory that still hurts. And suddenly, it slips in and begins to rewrite the narrative of your life. By morning, he looked fine. He smiled. He spoke normally. He showed up, but inside, he was already retreating. Decisions delayed. Opportunities ignored. Faith suffocated quietly. Because fear doesn't always stop you. Sometimes it just slows you down enough to keep you from becoming who God called you to be. But something shifted that day. Not outside, inside, because later that afternoon, he stumbled across a verse he had read before, but never really saw. God has not given you a spirit of fear, but of power, love, and a sound mind. He paused, read it again, and something in him resisted, because if fear wasn't from God, then why did it feel so natural, so logical, so convincing? That question cracked something open. Because maybe fear wasn't truth, maybe it was interference. And if that was true, then everything he had been agreeing with was a lie. That realization didn't bring instant peace, it brought confrontation. Because now he had to face something uncomfortable. If fear wasn't from God, why was he obeying it? That night, the battle returned. Same thoughts, same pressure, same voice. But this time, he didn't stay silent. What if you fail? He whispered back, God is with me. What if it falls apart? He works all things for good. What if you're not enough? His grace is sufficient. It felt awkward, forced, almost fake, but something subtle began to happen. The thoughts didn't stop, but they lost authority. Because for the first time, he wasn't just hearing fear, he was answering it. And that's where everything changes. Because scripture never tells you to avoid thoughts. It tells you to take them captive. Confront them. Bring them into alignment. That's not passive. That's war. And most people lose not because they lack faith, but because they never engage the battle in their mind. Days passed, then weeks. The fear didn't vanish overnight, but it started losing ground. Because every time it spoke, he responded. And slowly a pattern broke, but then came the real test. Opportunity, the very thing he had been praying for, finally appeared. And with it, fear came back stronger than ever. Now you'll really fail. This is too big. You're not ready. His heart pounded. This was the moment. Not theory, not prayer, decision. Because fear always peaks right before purpose. Just like the disciples in the storm. Waves crashing, wind screaming, water filling the boat, and Jesus sleeping. Think about that. The storm didn't wake him. Because peace isn't the absence of chaos, it's the presence of certainty. They panicked. Lord, we're going to drown. And Jesus stood, and with a word, silenced the storm. But then he turned and asked something deeper. Why are you afraid? Not because storms aren't real, but because fear reveals what you believe about who's in control. That man stood at his own storm. Same question echoing. Why are you afraid? He took a step, small, uncertain, but forward, and something invisible broke. Because fear loses power the moment you stop obeying it. He didn't feel fearless. His hands were shaking, his mind still racing, but he moved anyway, and heaven responds to movement. Always, because faith isn't proven in comfort, that it's proven in motion. That's why Peter walked on water. Not because the storm stopped, but because he stepped, and yes, he sank, but he also experienced what the others never did. And that's the difference. Fear keeps you in the boat. Faith calls you out, and somewhere between those two, destiny is decided. That step didn't solve everything, but it changed everything, because now he knew something he couldn't unlearn. Fear speaks, but it doesn't have the final word. And once you realize that, you stop treating fear like a guide and start seeing it for what it is, an intruder, not a strategist, not a liar that sounds like logic. But the deeper battle was still ahead, because fear wasn't just in his thoughts, it was in his identity. Hidden agreements, quiet beliefs, statements he never said out loud, but lived by every day. I'm not enough. I'll always struggle. Things never work out for me. That's where fear builds its stronghold. Not in moments, but in patterns. And until those agreements are broken, freedom feels temporary. Because you can fight fear externally, but still believe it internally. And belief is what gives fear permission to stay. That's why the Israelites wanted to go back to Egypt. Not because slavery was good, but because fear made it feel safe, familiar, predictable. And fear will always try to convince you that bondage is better than the unknown. That night, he faced that. Truth, not just the thoughts, but the agreements. And for the first time, he said it out loud. I have been believing lies. Silence filled the room. But it wasn't empty. It was holy. Because confession doesn't weaken you. It exposes what's been hiding. And what's exposed loses power. He kept going. I believed I'm not enough. I believed I'll fail. I believe God won't come through. Each word felt heavy. But with every sentence, something lifted. Because fear thrives in secrecy, but dies in light. And then he replaced it. Not with motivation, with truth. God is with me. I'm called. I am equipped. His promises are for me. This wasn't affirmation. This was realignment. And something shifted again, deeper this time, because he wasn't just fighting fear anymore. He was breaking agreement with it. And that is where transformation begins. Not when fear disappears, but when truth becomes louder. Days later, something unexpected happened. Peace, not loud. Not overwhelming, but steady, like a quiet anchor. And he realized something profound. God was never silent, that he just wasn't competing with the noise, because God speaks in stillness that I am. Whispers that in moments most people scroll past. And if your life is too loud, you'll miss him. That's why Elijah didn't find God in the fire or the earthquake, but in a whisper, because fear shouts, God invites. And only one leads to peace, that he began creating space. Less noise, more stillness, less distraction, more presence, and slowly God's voice became clearer. Not because it got louder, but because everything else got quieter. And in that clarity, fear lost its grip completely. Not permanently, but positionally, because now it no longer LED followed. And that changes everything. But the story doesn't end there, because what God does next is something most people never expect. That he doesn't just remove fear, he reverses it. What once controlled you becomes the very thing that gives you authority. And that is where everything turns. What happened next was not what he expected, because God didn't just take the fear away, he led him straight back to it. Not to destroy him, but to reveal something he had never seen before. The very place that once made him feel small was the exact place his purpose was waiting. And that's the part most people don't understand. God will often send you back into the territory that once broke you. Not so you can relive it, but so you can reclaim it. Weeks later, he found himself standing in a situation that used to paralyze him. Same pressure, same uncertainty, same internal tension rising in his chest. And right on cue, fear showed up again. But this time, it sounded different, not louder, just familiar. What if you fail again? What if nothing has really changed? For a moment, everything inside him paused because this was the test, not of emotion, but of identity. Before, he would have spiraled, overthought, retreated. But now, something in him stood up, not loudly, not dramatically, but firmly. And he said almost under his breath, "I know this voice." That sentence alone shifted the atmosphere, because recognition breaks deception. The moment you realize fear is speaking, you stop treating it like truth and start treating it like a trespasser. He didn't try to eliminate the feeling, that he didn't wait for confidence, that he did something far more powerful, that he moved anyway. And in that moment, something invisible shattered. Because fear is strongest when it predicts your behavior, when it knows you'll stop, hesitate, back away. But the moment you do the opposite, its power collapses. That's why obedience is so dangerous to fear. IT breaks the pattern. IT rewrites the script. IT announces to the unseen world, "I no longer belong to this voice." And heaven responds to that. Always that's exactly what happened with the 10 lepers. They cried out for healing, desperate, broken, rejected by society. Jesus didn't touch them immediately. He didn't perform a visible miracle on the spot. He simply said, "Go." That was itita and o evidence in o proof, just a command. And here's the part that changes everything. As they went, they were healed. Not before, not while standing still, but in motion. And that's how freedom works, that IT meets you in movement, not in hesitation, not in overthinking, in action. That man understood it now. Every step he took was not just progress, that IT was deliverance. Because fear cannot rule a life that refuses to stay still. Days turned into something new. Not perfect, but different. Because now when fear spoke, it didn't echo, IT got answered. And slowly, its language lost its influence. Because fear has patterns, predictable ones, that IT repeats the same phrases. This always happens. You've been here before. Don't get your hopes up. It's not creative, it's repetitive. Because repetition creates belief, and belief shapes reality. But once you interrupt the pattern, you interrupt the power. That's why Jesus, in the wilderness, never argued with the enemy. He didn't debate. He didn't analyze. That he responded with one thing: "It is written," again and again and again. Because truth doesn't negotiate with lies, that IT replaces them. That man began doing the same. When fear said, "You're not enough," he responded, "His grace is sufficient." When fear said, "You'll fail," he answered, "I can do all things through Christ." When fear said, "It's too late," he declared, "God makes all things new." At first, it felt like resistance. Then it became rhythm. Then it became identity. Because whatever you repeat, you reinforce. And eventually you become. But the deepest breakthrough came in a moment he didn't plan, a quiet one, unexpected. He was sitting alone, thinking about everything he had been through. The nights of anxiety, the battles in his mind, the moments he almost gave up, and suddenly, he realized something that changed everything. Fear didn't come to destroy him, IT came to reveal him. Because everything fear attacked was connected to something valuable: his calling, his voice, his purpose. The enemy doesn't waste effort, he targets what matters. And if fear had been fighting him this hard, it meant something inside him was dangerous to darkness. That realization flipped everything. Because now fear wasn't just something to escape, that IT was something to interpret, a signal, a clue, a sign pointing toward purpose. And that's when divine reversal began. Because God doesn't waste pain, he transforms. Just like Joseph, betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused, thrown into prison, forgotten. Every chapter of his life could have been ruled by fear, bitterness, anger. But years later, standing in power, face to face with the ones who hurt him, he said something that echoes through eternity. "You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good." That's not survival, that's transformation. That's what happens when fear loses its grip and purpose takes its place. That man saw it clearly now. Every fear he had battled was shaping something in him: strength, discernment, authority. And suddenly, he wasn't ashamed of his past anymore. He understood it, because what once silenced him was now becoming his message. And that's how God works, that he takes the place where you almost broke and turns it into the place where you speak with power. The anxiety becomes empathy. The struggle becomes wisdom. The fear becomes authority. And what once controlled you now serves you. But there was one final step, one that many people avoid because it feels too exposed, too vulnerable, too real. Confession, not just to God, but out loud. Because fear thrives in secrecy, it grows in silence, it feeds on what you hide. But the moment you speak it, it loses oxygen. That's why scripture says, confess and you'll be healed. Not might. Well, Dottie reached out, shared what he had been carrying, the thoughts, the fears, the hidden struggles. And instead of rejection, he found freedom, because darkness cannot survive in light. And everything fear had built in silence collapsed in truth completely. That was the moment he knew fear never had real power, only hidden influence. And now it was gone. Not because life became easy, but because truth became louder. And then something unexpected happened again. Not just peace, authority, quiet. Confidence, not based on emotion, but on identity. Because once you faced fear and refused to bow to it, something inside you changes permanently. You don't just feel different, you are different. And now he could see others who were trapped where he used to be. Same thoughts, same patterns, same silent battles. And instead of relating with fear, he spoke with clarity. Because now he knew, you don't silence fear by avoiding it. You silence it by confronting it with truth and moving anyway. That's when it hit him. This wasn't just about him. This was generational, because fear doesn't just affect one life, that it echoes through families, through choices, through silence passed down over time. But so does freedom. And the moment one person breaks the pattern, everything changes for everyone connected to them. He stood there, realizing something powerful. It stops with me. The fear, the hesitation, the limitation that it ends here. And in that decision, legacy was born. Because courage is contagious, just like fear is. And when you choose faith, even trembling, you shift atmospheres. You rewrite stories. You become living proof that fear does not have the final word. God does, that he always has. And right now, if you're hearing this, if something inside you is stirring, that's not Sluchi. That's invitation, because the same battle, the same voice, the same fear has been trying to shape your life too. But now you see it. Now you recognize it. Now you know it's not you. And it's not truth and so the question is no longer, why am I afraid? The question is, what will I do now that I see it? Will you keep agreeing with it? Or will you confront it? Will you stay still? Or will you move? Will you let it speak? Or will you answer back? Because everything changes the moment you decide, my obedience is greater than my fear. And if this message reached you, not just your ears, but your spirit, then don't ignore it. Hold on to it. Act on it. And if you know someone fighting silently, smiling outside, but drowning inside, share this with them. Because sometimes one message, one moment, one truth is all it takes to break a chain that's been there for years. And if you're not done yet, if you feel like there's more, there is. Because this isn't the end, it's the beginning. You've seen how fear is silenced, but now it's time to walk in. What replaces it? Authority, clarity, unshakable confidence. So stay close, because what comes next will change the way you live forever.